All right, so today we're diving into a region that, let's face it, is always making news. The Gulf states. We've got a whole bunch of analyses and articles here. And, I don't know about you, but I always see people talking about the Gulf states, but it's not that often we get to go deep on how they see things.
Yeah.
The geopolitics, the challenges they're facing, and how they're dealing with a world where, frankly, no one superpower is really calling all the shots anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of wild, right? You've got these countries that, for the longest time, people mostly knew for their, well, oil money, right? And now they're having to totally rethink their whole place in the world. Like the old rules, they don't really apply the same way.
Exactly. I mean, we can't talk about the Gulf states without talking about oil, obviously. But going through these sources, what really struck me was this sense of, I don't know, a much bigger shift happening. Like, take their whole friend-to-all approach to foreign policy, which has always been their thing. One article I read even called it an impossible balancing act,
Yeah.
especially with, the U.S. and China going at it the way they are.
And that's where things get even more complicated, right? Because you've got this Indo-Pacific concept popping up, which is being pushed as this big idea for regional cooperation. But let's be real, it's all about countering China's influence. So now the Gulf states are in this really tough spot. If they go all in on that, are they risking their relationship with China, which is a huge economic partner for them?
Yeah, it's like being forced to choose between your oldest friend and your, biggest investor.
Yeah.
Not a fun position to be in at all. And speaking of tough choices, we have to talk about their economies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every single article we have here basically says the same thing. Diversification isn't just some trendy idea for them. It's a necessity. Like, they have to make it work.
Absolutely. And we're not just talking about finding something else to sell besides oil, although that's obviously a huge part of it. This is about a complete transformation, right? Like these countries are investing massive amounts of money in renewable energy, tech, even stuff like tourism and, trying to become major players in global sports. It's pretty wild.
Okay, see, that's where I get a little stuck. Because we've all seen the headlines, right? Sports washing. They're pouring money into hosting events, buying up teams. I don't know, it feels like a PR move. But a lot of these sources suggest it's actually way more strategic than that.
Oh, for sure. It's about shaping their image, yeah, but it's also about, I think, projecting their influence, Soft power, trying to secure a seat at the table where the big decisions are being made. Take Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 plan. Sports is a key part of that. And it's not just about the glitz and glamour. It's about attracting investment, creating jobs, boosting their tourism industry. It's a long game they're playing.
So it's less about erasing their image and more about, taking control of the narrative.
Yeah.
Defining themselves on their own terms. Actually, that's a really interesting way to look at it. But at the same time, it's not like they could just throw money at every problem.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the human rights issue comes up a lot in these articles.
Yeah, and it's a valid concern. You can't ignore that. I think it highlights this really interesting tension that exists when you have a region undergoing such rapid modernization, but that also has these deeply rooted social and political structures. I mean, the West often criticizes their human rights record, but you have to remember that change, especially on that scale, it takes time, right? And it's all happening within a very specific cultural and historical context.
It's that push and pull, right? Wanting to be seen as modern global players while still holding on to their traditions, their values. Definitely a balancing act. But you know what else really jumped out at me from all this? The whole security question. Because the recent conflict, between Israel and Iran, it just really highlighted how vulnerable the Gulf actually is.
Without a doubt. And I think it forces us to rethink how we even define security these days, right? Because we're not just talking about physical borders anymore. This region is interconnected in so many ways. Airspace, maritime routes, cyberspace. Threats can come from anywhere now.
And that's got to be a scary thought. So if those old ways of thinking about defense aren't enough, what are they doing about it? This is where things get really interesting, don't they?
Well, for one thing, there's a clear move towards, self-reliance. Like they're investing heavily in their own defense industries, particularly stuff like drone technology, surveillance, things like that.
Which is kind of wild when you think about how for so long they've relied so heavily on the U.S. for security. But now you see them making deals with China for things like drones, fighter jets. It's like they're hedging their bets, trying to play all sides to maintain their autonomy. It's fascinating.
It's like the definition of a multipolar world, No one's really in charge the way they used to be. And for the Gulf states, it's both good and bad, right?
Okay, so break that down for me. What does a multipolar world actually mean for them, on the ground?
Well, it means they've got options now, which they didn't always have. They can kind of, play the US and China off each other, leverage those relationships to get better deals, find partners who give them the best advantage. And the thing is, it's risky.
Because if one of those relationships goes south.
Exactly. They could get caught in the crossfire, right? Become collateral damage in someone else's fight. It's a high wire act, for sure.
And we see that playing out in how they deal with China, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it really struck me how many of these articles talked about China, not just as a customer for their oil anymore, but as like a potential security partner.
Yeah.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah, no kidding. It tells you just how much things have changed, because for so long they've relied on the U.S. for that security blanket, But it's not like they can just swap one out for the other. The U.S. is definitely watching all this very closely, and they're not exactly thrilled about China moving in.
So it's this balancing act again, right?
Yeah.
Getting closer to China without pushing the U.S. away completely. Talk about pressure. But even with all that's going on externally, the articles we have here also talk about the internal pressures they're facing.
Yeah, and those are just as important, right? I mean, the economic stuff gets a lot of attention, the whole diversification thing, and rightfully so. But you can't forget about the social and political side of the coin. Like, how do you transform your economy that drastically without, causing some serious upheaval?
One article I read used this phrase. It was talking about how they're basically trying to build a future that looks really different from their past, but they've still got like the ghosts of tradition hanging over everything.
And that's the challenge, isn't it? When you have these massive economic changes happening so fast, but you're also trying to hold on to your identity, your values, it creates friction. It's inevitable.
Totally. And then, of course, there's the whole security question, which feels like a whole different ball game now that we're talking about threats that go way beyond physical borders. I mean, one article mentions cyber attacks, the vulnerability of their shipping routes, stuff that just wasn't even on the radar a few decades ago.
It's a whole new world, security-wise. The old playbooks don't really cut it anymore, and you can see them trying to adapt. Like that push for self-reliance we were talking about, that's part of it. But they're also having to rethink their whole approach to defense.
Okay, so they're investing in their own defense industries, which makes sense.
Uh-huh.
But I also saw some stuff about them looking at new alliances, bringing in other partners besides the U.S. It's like they're diversifying their security portfolio, just like they're trying to diversify their economies.
Right. Why put all your eggs in one basket? Right. Especially in this day and age. I think what they're trying to do is reduce their dependence on any one power, whether it's for weapons, intelligence, whatever. It gives them more options, more flexibility.
It's funny. After spending all this time really digging into everything about the Gulf states, it's kind of mind-blowing, right? They're dealing with so much economic turmoil, this whole multipolar world thing, redefining what security even means. And that's not even getting into their own internal struggles. It's a lot.
It really is. And I think it just shows you how adaptable they're having to be. For decades, people saw them as, defined by oil and their alliances with powerful countries. But now they're writing a whole new chapter. They've got more control, but the challenges are way more complex.
And the whole world is watching how they handle it, right? It's like they're under a microscope. One article, I think it was the one from Foreign Policy, even compared it to, get this, the fall of the Roman Empire.
Wow.
Yeah, a little dramatic maybe. But their point was that what the Gulf states do now, the decisions they make, it's going to have a ripple effect for decades. And honestly, I think they're right.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't overstate their importance, right? They're at the center of everything. Energy, fighting terrorism, even the future of globalization. What happens over there doesn't stay over there,
So true. And with everything changing so fast, it makes you wonder, what's the end game here? Like, if they pull this off, what does success even look like for the Gulf states in this new world order?
That is the million-dollar question, and I don't think there's one easy answer. But if we look at what we've talked about today, a few things stand out. First, they have to nail this economic diversification thing, moving away from oil dependence and becoming hubs for innovation, technology. That's got to be the goal.
Which is kind of ironic, right? Because they're trying to jump into this post-oil future while still, making a killing from oil in the present.
Totally. Short game, long game, they've got to play both at the same time. And another thing, they want a seat at the big table, right? Not just being invited, but actually shaping the conversation, having real influence.
And that goes back to those alliances we were talking about. It's not about picking sides. It's about building relationships that give them leverage. They're playing chess, not checkers.
Exactly. And one last thing I'll add. None of this works if they can't manage the pressure cooker at home,
Yeah.
all the internal stuff. They've got to figure out how to modernize without leaving their own people behind. Balance progress with, well, with not tearing their own society apart.
It's a tightrope walk, that's for sure, on every level. Global power struggles, economic transformation, their own social fabric. It's a lot to juggle.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what we wanted to leave you with today.
Yeah, the Gulf states often get reduced to headlines about like oil money or conflict, right? But what we've seen is it's way more complicated than that. They're not just reacting to events, they're shaping them.
And that's what makes it all so interesting. We're talking about a region at a crossroads, facing these huge challenges, but also these huge opportunities, the likes of which they've never seen before. And honestly, how they handle it, it's going to affect all of us. So thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.